Um, for those who yearn for peace in the Middle East, for those in the Arab lands, for those in Europe, for those all around the world who yearn for peace, we must do everything we possibly can to stop the terror.
Tell me, Mr. Blair, how do you manage to sleep at night?
Now watch this drive. All right.
The man is a war criminal!
Can I just say, actually, on the record, what he said about Iraq and JP Morgan is completely and totally untrue.
Keir Starmer, you've said that Israel has the right to defend itself. Does that include cutting off food, water, power to Gaza?
Well, what we've seen is appalling and shocking acts of terrorism, the murder of men, women, children by Hamas. And so responsibility lies with Hamas, and Israel has the right to defend herself and take action in relation to the ongoing hostage situation.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
It's clear to me that it's wrong to bomb a refugee camp. But clearly, if there is a military objective, it can be legally justifiable. It's for Israel to explain its actions.
I do understand why some are calling for a ceasefire. I do not think that that is the right call now.
On October 31st, leader of the UK Labour Party and war crime liker, Sir Keir Starmer, known sometimes by his government name, Keir Starmer, or Keith for short, proudly wore a poppy on his lapel while giving a speech at Chatham House. I don't think this speech was supposed to be spooky, despite taking place on Halloween. Partially because Keir Starmer is allergic to happiness, and having fun is something his advisors have time and time again warned him as grounds for expulsion from the Labour Party, because it sounds too much like something a communist might do. Regardless, the speech sent chills down my spine, and the spines of many people around the country. Not that we didn't know it was coming, but the image of someone proudly wearing a symbol of mourning for all those killed in war, particularly in response to the horrors of World War I, continuing to back the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people by the State of Israel, using US and UK weapons and backing, is frankly bone-chilling.
Keir Starmer, the reason that dozens of Labour MPs are urging you to call for a ceasefire is because over 3,000 children are dead. Because you haven't done that today, we know that shadow ministers are considering resigning. The mayors of London and Manchester disagree with you. The leader Labour in Scotland says that you have hurt Muslim communities. How on earth are you going to bring your party back from this level of division?
Well, we've all seen those images of children dead, and there's no unseeing those images. And I think it's really important to understand that. For the reasons I set out, notwithstanding that I do understand why some are calling for a ceasefire, I do not think that that is the right call now.
Well, gentlemen, it seems you have little option now but to declare war immediately.
Well, this is quite impossible. I couldn't take such a decision without referring to my superior, Chris Patton. He's in Hong Kong.
Good, because he's on the line now via satellite. Mr. Patton, what do you think of the idea of a war now? I'll take that as a yes.
Very well, it's war.
War it is.
That's it, Chris. It's war. War has broken out. This is a war.
That's it. Yes, it's war.
When I was a kid, I was taught that the poppy was a symbol of remembrance, a call to never forget the horrors of war. Every casualty of war is a human being, and every death of a human being is a tragedy. The thing is, I took this to mean the poppy was a peace symbol, and frankly, I was kind of mistaken in that belief. It's a symbol of remembrance, yes, but if you wanted to express what little me thought people were trying to express by wearing the poppy, by the time I was doing it, you'd be wearing the white poppy. An explicit pacifist symbol and a counter to the exploitation of the red poppy symbol by nationalists, warmongers, and the bloodthirsty shower of bastards that continue to dominate the highest offices of our government.
Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel has a right to exist. Israel has been attacked by terrorists. It has every right to both defend itself, get its hostages back, and protect its citizens.
We stand with Israel. The United Kingdom stands with Israel against this terrorism today, tomorrow, and always.
I think I've been pretty clear that these are hate marches. They are, I think chanting of jihad on the streets of Britain in the 21st century is utterly despicable.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! What do you want? Ceasefire! When do you want it? Now!
The ayes to the right, 125. The noes to the left, 293.
So the noes have it, the noes have it.
Even so, remembrance of the war dead should have given Keith some pause. The Palestinian people have been subject to a genocidal campaign of apartheid, expulsion and extermination for over 70 years now. If we are to remember them, as the poppy supposedly urges us to, since it long stopped being just about World War I, then we owe it to every person crushed by the iron fist of the colonialist fascist regime in Israel to remember them. Human beings all, with friends, family, loved ones, hopes, dreams, ambitions, favourite foods, favourite colours, likes, dislikes, not numbers, but people. People Starmer seems more than happy to let die from missile strikes on hospitals, on refugee camps, on their homes. People Starmer is completely fine with being struck with white phosphorus, be they fighters, journalists, doctors, children. Every war crime done against them does not move him 1 inch, apparently. And yet, Keir Starmer proudly admits that this is his stance, while wearing a poppy. Starmer may want us to forget, but we will do no such thing. We will remember them. During his speech, Starmer said that, "While I understand calls for a ceasefire, at this stage, I do not believe that this is the correct position now. Hamas would be emboldened and start preparing for future violence immediately." The Labour leader said that asking Israel for a humanitarian pause to let aid into Gaza was the only credible approach that has any chance of surviving what we all want to see in Gaza, the urgent alleviation of Palestinian suffering. Starmer also refused to say whether he thought Israel was committing war crimes in Gaza. This was after he previously endorsed Israel cutting off power and water to the territory, and then backtracked, claiming he hadn't meant what he had blatantly said. Labour, a vote for genocide. Predictably, Starmer's comments caused uproar on social media. Meanwhile, in person, Starmer was booed and called a war criminal as he left Chatham House. And so, much as this might give me an aneurysm, I'm going to try and understand how someone like Keir Starmer squares this circle in his mind. How does a man wear a symbol of remembrance and give the green light to a fascist regime to commit genocide, guaranteeing he'll look the other way as they break international law and turn one of the most beautiful places on earth into rubble for a pebble of political gain from the demons in the Murdoch press? And while we're here, let's take a look at what the poppy really is, and how it got to this point. How did the poppy go from a symbol of a nation's mourning over a pointless and dreadful war to the public relations tool of choice for warmongers and all major political parties in Britain to signal their patriotism and solemnity as the blood on their hands grows an ever-deepening shade of crimson? I'm Bridget Empire, science and culture correspondent for, at this point, the least problematic fake newspaper on the island of Great Britain, just by the fact that our positions have remained stale and dull, while the rest of the press has become a gaggle of hyenas thirsty for the blood of the innocent. That was supposed to be our job, and now here we are looking like we're fucking Amnesty International or something. Today, we're going to be turning the poppy over, shaking it for its lunch money, and hopefully getting out enough opium from its seeds that I'll be high enough to forget that I ever worked for Keir Starmer in the first place, back when he was still pretending to be left-wing.
It started as a simple symbol of remembrance, but in recent years, the poppy has grown far beyond the lapel. They've popped up in all sorts of places, from puppets to toasters, causing tensions between those who support it as well as those who don't. And for some, the decision not to wear a poppy is national news. We'll hear later about the footballer who's received death threats for not wearing it. You might have heard the term poppy fascism sometimes used to describe people who draw attention to public figures who don't wear the poppy. But they're a tradition that has been running for 100 years. So where did it begin? Let's go back to 1915, World War I.
The Poppy Appeal in the UK is run by the Royal British Legion, a charity established in 1921 in the wake of the horrors of World War I, which currently plays the role of support group and recovery/rehab resources for military veterans in the UK, largely using the money made through the Poppy Appeal. For those of you outside the Commonwealth, this is going to sound a bit ridiculous, but stick with me. Every year, every politician, every TV presenter, every public figure, and most regular citizens, if they're in work or formal attire, are expected to wear a red poppy lapel, a fake one, not the actual flower, sourced from this Poppy Appeal, to coincide with the lead-up to Remembrance Sunday, on the 11th of November, where a 2-minute silence is usually taken at 11 AM to remember the victims of World War I, on the anniversary of its end. Much like Christmas in the States, poppy season seems to come earlier and earlier every year, and so now in October, people like War Crimes Jr. over here, wearing the poppy to the speech that is supposed to save him from shedding the votes of everyone in Britain with a soul. When the Poppy Appeal began in 1921, the poppies raised over £106,000, which was a lot of money at the time, which was used to help the veterans of World War I with employment and housing. Much like now, the country had ripped these people from their families, thrown them at machine gun fire, and then left those that didn't die in the trenches to suffer. The Poppy Appeal did a lot to help when the state refused to look after those it had sent to die in a pointless war, and for 100 years it has continued to do so, though, as you might imagine, a charity with an explicit military connection, and one that explicitly aims to help veterans over those the wars fought by Britain might have wreaked havoc upon, can be, and indeed has been used, for cynical political gain. And its even more nefarious cousin, nationalism.
A poppy, wearing a white poppy, that the red of the poppy is glorifying war rather than the colour of it reflecting the horror. Is it the colour of it, or is it the fact that it's the British Legion?
No, it's not the colour of it. I mean, if the British Legion wasn't involved in some of these other problematic areas, then I would happily wear the poppy. I think it's important, and I think that some of the work that they do is actually very, very good. But I think because of all of these other issues.
The use of the poppy as a symbol of war remembrance dates back to the Napoleonic Wars, where the battlefields of the era, made arid and fertile by the war, eventually gave way to poppy fields, growing amongst the bodies of the fallen. Perhaps counterintuitively given the poppy's eventual ties to the celebration of armed forces, poppies became a symbol of hope and peace, and remembering the sacrifices of those who now rested in fields of red flowers. Under World War I, the same thing occurred, where thousands lay dead, very little could grow, until the poppies emerged. This was immortalised in the poem In Flanders Fields, and the message of the poem became inextricably tied to how the symbolic power of the poppy would manifest from that point on, with its call for future generations to pick up where the dead fell, to continue their fight and honour them, as well as mourning them and knowing the horror they faced.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
The British Legion itself puts a lot of stock in this poem, and the resulting solidification of the poppy as a symbol of not just remembrance, but hope, including hope for a positive future and a peaceful world. And yet, is this what hope looks like? Is this a vision for a peaceful world? Do we really want to put the criminal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan on the level with the world wars? Because they certainly didn't help bring peace. Quite the fucking opposite, actually. In fact, World War I, pretty famously not a peaceful end. In fact, it led directly to the conditions that would eventually bring about World War II. And now, in the midst of a genocide in Palestine, a poppy to symbolise remembrance and hope? Is Keir Starmer working towards a vision of a peaceful world when he makes it his duty to be an apologist for some of the most grievous mass civilians in living memory?
Dignity that is still left in the world and empathy for our brothers and sisters in Gaza.
In fact, the writer of In Flanders Fields, John McCrae, explicitly described the Battle of Ypres, in which he fought, as a nightmare. And it was. This was one of the first times ever in human history that a chemical weapon was used in war. And the chlorine gas the Germans deployed against the Allied line devastated McCrae's comrades. Even besides that, McCrae describes the battle thusly. For 70 days and 17 nights, none of us have had our clothes off, nor our boots even, except occasionally. And all that time while I was awake, gunfire and rifle fire never ceased for 60 seconds. And behind it all was the constant background of the sights of the dead, the wounded, the maimed, and a terrible anxiety, lest the line should give way. So, is it wrong that we use this man's poetry, the beauty of his words, for what the poppy in the modern day is slowly morphed into? A piece of propaganda for the military-industrial complex, in order to worship the armed forces, to not question those who have died, no matter in whose name they died and ultimately what for? Would McCrae have approved of Starmer calling for the genocide of the Palestinian people while wearing a poppy? Of Tony Blair launching illegal wars that killed millions in Iraq and Afghanistan, without second thought as to whether each November he would wear a poppy without fail, with no sense of irony, no cognitive dissonance, no moment of reflection to realise the weight of the symbol on his lapel, and its original intent, a call for hope. Hope for a peaceful future? I mean, John McCrae was a Canadian lieutenant colonel, so if we're being honest, I might be giving him a little too much credit. But the war did devastate him, and he clearly did not see it as a positive thing. And yet, even a cursory glance at Google will give you a taste for how the symbol of the poppy has changed. No longer does it simply cry for remembrance and peace, but it's morphed into a cynical tool, a symbol for jingoism, and for public shaming of those who prefer peace over war. For example, in 1993, a video game with an anti-war message and a poppy on the cover was released called Cannon Fodder. The Royal British Legion, remember them, they make the poppy, they teamed up with sitting politicians and declared it offensive to millions and even monstrous. Multiple British Army veterans have argued that the poppy appeal has been misused to marshal support for any and all British military activities, including those that would put you in The Hague if your name wasn't Tony Blair. The TV presenter and prince that was promised, Jon Snow, in 2006, described the by now compulsory use of the poppy by all public figures as poppy fascism, challenging the cluster of ideas represented by the symbol. In response, a Gulf War veteran was quoted by saying, "Not to wear the poppy is an insult to the war dead." In the same vein, columnist Dan O'Neill in 2011 wrote that presenters and politicians seem to compete in a race to be first. Poppies start sprouting in mid-October, while the absence of a poppy is interpreted as an absence of concern for the war dead, almost as an unpatriotic act of treachery. In the 1970s, the Royal British Legion lost a whole generation, who saw the remembrance tradition as backward-looking corporate symbols that had lost all their meaning. In Ireland, red poppies commemorating Armistice Day is associated with British imperialism and the Orange Movement in Ulster, due to the way it was weaponised by British occupiers and their supporters.
What are you looking at, you tangerine too?
Okay, Grandad.
I think what's happened here is, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your father has just driven through a police barricade.
Well, it's done now.
Oh, that's true. It's probably not even that big a deal if you ignore the fact that orange men are circling us as though we're their fucking prey.
It'll be grand. I'm starting to understand how Moby Dick must feel.
In 2010, a collective of British Army veterans wrote an open letter to the poppy appeal, complaining it had become excessive and was being used to marshal support for British military interventions in the Middle East. And the pressuring of people to wear poppies was tantamount to pressure to support the increasingly unpopular and always horrific war on terror. The letter organiser, Ben Griffin, who served in Iraq and Afghanistan before refusing to return, said, "We are concerned that people are trying to take ownership of the poppy for political ends. It is almost as if they're trying to garner support for our boys, and any criticism of the wars as a betrayal. That is not what the poppy was all about to start with. It was about remembrance and peace. Never again. The government should be supporting these casualties. They are their liability, not the British Legion's." Another signatory said, "I don't have a problem with the British Legion, which does wonderful work, but it is the sanitisation which concerns me. Part of me wants to be sensitive to the families who have lost loved ones, And part of me wants to throw a bucket of blood into the living rooms of the nation every night to show people the true meaning of war. To which the Royal British Legion responded, "There is nothing in our appeal or campaigning which supports or does not support war. We are totally neutral. We are not a warmongering organisation. We don't have a position in the war in Iraq or anywhere else. These boys didn't send themselves to Iraq. That's a decision for the politicians." But are you though? Neutral, that is. Wasn't that the point of the open letter, of the complaints? Is it not obvious that if you don't support the war in Iraq, then you're being used by those that do? You can't inextricably tie yourself to war and the armed forces in the country and then wipe your hands of anything that comes from that, as if you're never making a political statement. If you truly objected, you would be saying something. After all, what's more political than war? 4 years later, these same veterans protested by holding an alternative remembrance service, holding a wreath of white poppies, the pacifist symbol born of critiques like theirs of the poppy's appropriation and jingoism, holding a banner that read, "Never again," and wearing tops that read, "War is organised murder." A direct quote from one of the last surviving veterans of World War I, Harry Patch. And as if this all wasn't sad enough, in 2018, The Independent reported that the Royal British Legion held contracts with private prisons, essentially using slave labour of prisoners to make these symbols that supposedly represent hope, remembrance of suffering, and a wish for peace. So with that in mind, Keir Starmer and the poppy might well deserve each other. And then there's, of course, Britain's history with opium and its colonialism in China and Afghanistan. Chinese officials actually requested British officials not wear the poppy in China, as it would be seen as offensive. For those who don't know, the British Empire fought multiple wars in China so that they could get away with trading opium grown in the Indian subcontinent for Chinese luxury goods that had massive demand in Britain, most notably tea. China under the Qing dynasty banned the opium trade because of course they would, and in response, Britain started murdering people. It was from this conflict that Hong Kong would be ceded to the British under the Treaty of Nanking. Over 3,000 Chinese people were killed and 4,000 wounded. You know, I've heard a lot of people make hay about the mistakes that socialist experiments made, but these growing pains of early capitalism are literally stories of genocide, slavery, and colonialism. And every hiccup sees thousands dead. And for what? For tea? I'm just saying it's a good thing that the Royal British Legion wasn't around then, or this would be an even more depressing video. Speaking of depressing...
On September the 11th, enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country. Americans have known wars, but for the past 136 years, they have been wars on foreign soil, except for one Sunday in 1941.
Did you know that one of the major reasons behind the war in Afghanistan was so that the West could establish a monopoly on opium production? The Taliban have tried to ban the stuff, but the US really needed a tight grip on the heroin trade for totally legitimate and not at all dodgy reasons. Incidentally, don't look up how the CIA has previously used the drug trade to fund right-wing death squads in the global south and imprison the black communities in the US en masse. I mean, don't. It doesn't actually have anything to do with this point, it's just very depressing. Anyway, the Taliban before the US intervention, and now after the US left Afghanistan, banned the cultivation of opium. And the United States has been pretty open about how it spent $8 billion over 15 years to make sure the US, and not the fundamentalist group, would have ultimate control over the opium and heroin trade. From airstrikes to raids on suspected labs. Anyway, I'm sure they had a righteous aim in invading the country where Bin Laden demonstrably was not hiding, and that this isn't exactly the kind of conflict that led to people turning away from the poppy as a symbol. Even without its explicit links to production of opium and colonialism for the sake of seizing control of opium production. No, not at all. Speaking of the war in Afghanistan, if you really want to hold into the idea of a poppy as a symbol of peace and remembrance, don't think about Tony Blair. Like, at all. Much like all British politicians of his era and since, Blair spent every November wearing the poppy, and laid his poppy wreaths on the cenotaph in London, all while actively planning the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's not just me being an old lefty Blair hater, these are the words of a veteran from the Royal Air Force who's found himself extremely critical of how politicians cynically use remembrance events to launder their reputation and drum up support for some of the worst human rights abuses this country has committed in recent years. I've been dismayed and enraged in equal measure to see British politicians cry their crocodile tears of never again at the cenotaph, said Steve Heaney, a Welsh RAF veteran. Tony Blair laid a wreath in 2002 while planning the invasion of Iraq. Cameron and May take their turn at the cenotaph, while veterans are disproportionately represented in prison populations as homeless and suffering mental health issues. Shameful. It's obviously not just Blair who has used the symbol of the poppy to stand against the very things it was invented for, but as our generation's most prolific British warmonger, it's pretty important that we use him as a test case here. Sunak and Starmer are both wearing poppies while supporting in Palestine too, and the Tories have spent over a decade forcing austerity on the country while pretending to give a shit about the dead when they clearly can't even bring themselves to shed a tear for the living. And that's not to mention all the wars Britain has supported, funded and manufactured weapons for in the time since the illegal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, in the words of another veteran, Gavin Williamson talks about remembering the dead, but his own policies mean that there are more dead people to remember, said the PPU's Simon Hill. As Williamson rattles his charity tins, children in Yemen are dying with British-made bombs sold with the licenses that UK ministers have approved. 100 years after the failure of the war to end all wars, Williamson is helping to make another world war more likely with his support for Trump's nuclear build-up. All of these things are examples of the hypocrisy of the poppy appeal on full display. What started as a somber symbol that gave much-needed aid to those the state had left behind has little of its original intent left. The symbol calls for worship for the armed forces, for unquestioning loyalty to military decisions made by our political class, however awful they might be, and for enforced national pride. There is, however, one small thing about the modern-day poppy that does warm my angry black heart a little though. And that's the story behind the official Prime Minister's portrait of Tony Blair. He must have felt safe. For his first ever official portrait, Tony Blair agreed to be painted by Jonathan Yeo, the son of a Conservative MP. Hardly a radical, so unlikely to mention the war. Mr. Blair had recently spent his final days as Prime Minister trying to ensure he would be remembered for something, anything, other than the disastrous invasion of Iraq. But he was wearing a poppy, because the sitting was around the time of Remembrance Sunday, and when the portrait was unveiled last week, it showed the red flower burning bright against the washed-out colours of his suit, looking like a strong comment on the war. I very slightly exaggerated it through colour, said the artist, who'd been looking for a way to comment on Iraq. Tony Blair's legacy, everyone. A man more comfortable in the company of Tories than anyone else, and who, even in death, will have his visage stained where the blood he spilled in Iraq. The blood of people who we should, in fact, remember, take time to mourn, and make sure acts like the Iraq War never happen again. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going dawn of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. And so we come full circle. Do Keir Starmer and the poppy deserve each other? Clearly its survival throughout the Iraq War and beyond necessitated its transformation into a monster. And while never again should be our first thoughts upon seeing the poppy, Starmer has modelled himself on Tony Blair. Blind to the fact that the warmonger that destroyed the Labour Party forever is terminally unpopular for the exact sorts of war crimes that Starmer is advocating for in the midst of an ongoing genocide. Though you might well make the argument that the poppy is but a symbol of mourning and remembrance. Well, for over 100 years, the poppy has been the British nation's symbol of remembrance. With its blood-red petals and wild, almost uncontrollable nature, the poppy has been worn on the lapels and arts of numerous British generations. Throughout its life course, however, the poppy has not remained a static and unchanging symbol of remembrance. Our times have changed, and so has the meaning of the poppy on the lapel. And if Starmer can wear it and not feel a bit hypocritical, as he defends the bombing of hospitals and refugee camps, the use of white phosphorus, the massacring of children, well, then maybe it's not just Starmer that's an empty vessel, being as he is a puppet, with Peter Mandelson of Jeffrey Epstein's best friends fame, his hand up his arse. The poppy, today, is empty, devoid of the poetry from which it was inspired. Just another vehicle to peddle support for the worst horrors imaginable. In the name of a war long since past, today's politicians perform mourning and use the social and political capital that earns them to sign off on the deaths of millions. Thanks for watching.
When we walked in fields of gold, so she took her love for to gaze awhile on the fields of barley. In his arms she fell.
Hey everyone, thank you for watching this to the end. Happy Poppy. That's not a thing people say. Poppy Halloween? No, I'll work on something. Thank you for watching to the end, and thank you especially for those of you who support me on Ko-fi or PayPal or Patreon. Links underneath. I don't want to make a. That was not on the script. I don't know where I am. Anyway. If you like this video and you feel inspired to throw me $1, then you're welcome to sign up to my Patreon, and you should, where if you sign up, you get early access to all my videos, you get exclusive content, you get to join the Patrons Discord, you get my Nintendo Switch friend code, you get discounts on any future merchandise, and you get your name right out at the end of each video, just like these wonderful people. Raven Tempest, Shield Vaden, Robin Podolsky, Infernal Ramblings, Exploding Turtle, Casual Observer, Terry Roberts, Manta Ray, Courtney Burmack, Sleepy Slug, Philippa Tabrugga, Soma Piglet, Meredith Matthews, 4IS, Artie Wolf, Eden Gala, Greg Noble, No Kings, Only Fools, Deanna McMillan, Caroline Regalado, Alexandra Lilly, PJ Lesberell, Howard Lott, Lara Van Loon, Narania, Scarchan, and Joey Cobalt. Thanks so much for your help, guys. It means the world to me. Like, truly. Truly, and, doesn't the word for truly? Probably is. Anyway, I love you all. See you next time.
As we lie in fields of gold, you remember.
Anyway, the Taliban before the US intervention. Anyway, the Taliban before the US intervention. Anyway, the Taliban. Anyway, the Taliban. Anyway, the Taliban doesn't really matter to me. To me. Mama, the Taliban, they are in Afghanistan. Not great if you're not a man. Goodbye, corrupt US-backed government. Hello, Taliban also corrupt. It's gonna kill myself.